First and foremost, I have to say what an incredible honor it is to be here. I am so in awe and in admiration of the wonderful work that you do and the wonderful work that No More Martyrs does. It is truly amazing movement work, and to be here with you all as we are amplifying voices of those who are underserved and often overlooked. It is certainly a privilege. I also want to say to the esteemed peers, the last panel was phenomenal. What can, I say beyond what has already been said about the immense impact of trauma, right? And our ability to bounce back from it, how it is really contingent upon how we show up as community for each other. So glad to be here. Alrighty, so today we are going to talk about love and love abundantly. And what is that about? It's about Black queer romance and the extent to which sometimes we as Black queer folk might feel that we have to de-romanticize or desexualize our own experiences in order to protect ourselves, in order to survive socially, and in order to kind of acquire this picket fence life that we often like to think about that exists within like the pillars of heteronormativity and white supremacy. So before I start, I want to go ahead and ask you to do something a little crazy. It might be uncomfortable, but that's okay, because that is what we aim to do. We want to disrupt comfort so that we can really get to where we need to do. So what I want you to do is I want you to hug yourself. Okay, I want you to take a second and I want you to hug yourself, right? Because who would I be to come on here and talk about romance that occurs between two people or multiple people, right? And not engage the romance that starts with ourselves, okay? So I want to see you. I can't see you, but I want to feel you, okay? And I'm gonna know I have a sixth sense for it. I wanna feel you right now, okay? And hug yourself, and hug yourself. And the reason that I want us to take a second to do this is because I know that we are here for all of these great causes, for all of these great sessions, but I understand that the world around us is very much still going on, right? There's a lot of heaviness right now. There's a lot of intensity. You are dealing with the own weight of your own world. And it's beautiful for us to be able to come here and take a second away, but the reality is there's a lot going on in your world right now. So I want you to hug yourself. I want you to take a second to hold space for yourself. I want you to take a second to hold yourself and to hold space for yourself. Because the beautiful thing is, and I like to think about it this way, whenever we're anxious, whenever we're overwhelmed, I think about the fact that my body is basically telling me it loves me so much. And it's worried about my safety, right? It's worried about if I am in danger. And because of that, that's why I'm feeling some of the physiological effects of my anxiety, right? So we're soothing ourselves right now. We're letting ourselves know that we are safe. We're letting ourselves know that we are okay. We're hugging ourselves. We're making space for ourselves. We're holding ourselves, and we're holding space for ourselves. Now, I hope, with integrity, I hope y'all engaged me for that. And I hope at the very least for those of you who either were hugging yourselves or at least thought about the activity, hopefully you're feeling some peace, or hopefully you're thinking, okay, this joker is pretty corny. And at least it made you smile, right? At least you have a funny story to tell somebody after the presentation. So today's presentation, we're going to talk about Black queer romance, right? And I want us to be able to identify how Black queer narratives are able to operate. And I want us to think critically about how Black queer folk are able to approach love and romance, right? How we're able to access it. What are those barriers to access, perhaps? And how we interpret who we are in these loves, right? And I also want us to understand that with respect to those barriers, there is a psychological aftermath, right? So something that we know is kind of inherent in a lot of queer experiences is experiences of concealability, right? Where we feel as though we have to hide a part of ourselves away in order to advance, whether that be in a professional setting, whether that be in academic settings, our entrepreneurial endeavors, or whether that be the very real relationships that we have with family and friends. There's often a lot on the line when we talk about journeying into our queer experiences. And as a consequence, the way that we are able to engage love, the way that we are able to engage romance has a very significant impact on our mental health well-being. And what I love about the concept of romance, particularly as a focus of research study, is that it feels really sticky, right? So when we talk about a lot of the movement work we're doing, and we think about things like legislation, right? When we think about, grievances against humanity, and we think about the constitutionality of things, and we think about the protests, we think about various different legs of the movement work march, and they feel very concrete, right? It's really hard to argue the justness of people being done wrong, right? But when it comes to something like romance, romance is sticky, especially when it comes to professional settings where we like to keep things to a degree very objective. And when we're talking about romance, we're talking about something that is very nuanced. We're talking about something that is very subjective, right? And in the grand scheme of things, when we start to talk about romance and the positive impact that healthy love and that healthy romance has on our lives, we see that when we as Black queer folk are given the space to engage these narratives, to engage these curiosities, we see an enrichment in the lives we lead. All right, so background check, because it's important to know who's talking to you, right? So I am Joshua Baker. Once again, I am a licensed master social worker based in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. I received my bachelor's and master's from the illustrious Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University. I saw some Bulldogs in the chat earlier. I love to see it. I'm also a second-year PhD student at the University of Alabama in the Department of Psychology. And I get the privilege of a lifetime to work as the youth program coordinator at the Knights and Orchids Society Incorporated, an organization just doing incredible work to build the power of Black, trans, and queer folk across the South. And when I say, I assure you, this is the most fulfilling work that I've ever done. It truly is a privilege to be able to do what I do. And this leads me into something that I also feel is important before we jump into the presentation. What is the purpose of my movement work? If I was to try to put it succinctly, if I was to try to condense it down to one sentence, I would say that the purpose of my movement work is creating a world that Black queer youth don't have to heal from, right? I work with trans and queer youth who are so incredible, so amazing, so visionary, so articulate in their experiences, right? And there are some times where I'm truly humbled in the work because I realize simply them being who they are makes them a target of violence. It makes them a target of hate, right? And I dream of a world where that's not the case. I dream of a world where young folk don't have to be their own activists, where they don't have to literally muddle through these griefs and these traumas and figure out how to compartmentalize and how to show up on the picket lines. I want soft life for Black queer folk generally, but specifically in this context, I want a soft life for Black queer youth, right? I don't want them to have to live lives that they have to heal from. And part of that, why I do also focus on that idea of Black queer youth not having to heal from these, childhoods and these adolescence experiences is because when I think about Black queer folk in general, and I think about a lot of our trauma and I think about a lot of our grief, what I recognize is that a lot of us, even as adults, are like Black queer children reconciling some things that happen as children, that happen as teenagers, right? Because even as an adult, you definitely face discrimination, you definitely face prejudice, you definitely face barriers to your joy, but there is at least in adulthood some sense of autonomy, right? There is some sense of fight back, but I think about a lot of us in our first experiences as children when we understood we were different, when we understood, even without language, that there was something different about our queerness, something that set us apart, something that would subject us to violence, to discrimination, before we even had language for that. And we understood that there was something different about us. That was an amazing moment for people to swoop in and to protect us, right? And to lift us up and to see us positively and to affirm us. But for a lot of us, that wasn't our experience. For a lot of us, we were quietly queer and sitting in the church pews hearing God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? And that stung because in that moment, you knew something was wrong. Or maybe when you were in junior high. And at this point, you have more of a language of who you are, but your homeboys, they're making jokes about queer people, right? And you can't necessarily say anything because you can't out yourself. You can't put yourself in the line of fire, but you are slowly but surely, as you are growing, you are seeing all of these betrayals, and they're quiet betrayals, because you can't show how offended you are because you're not supposed to be what is being targeted, right? So yeah, and all of the work that I'm doing, whether it's around Black queer youth or whether it's around Black queer adults, it is community work, and that is why I love to do it. There was a time in my life where, you know, pre-disclosure, I never thought I would be able to engage in the things that I'm really passionate about, and for me, that is Black queer liberation. All right, so here's the fun part, and I want y'all to feel free to engage the chat. I want to give you a second before we get further into this presentation. I want you to think about a love that you have lived in, okay? And even if for a moment, okay? Even if you've imagined it, okay? You know, I'm not knocking any of the girls on the call. I want you to think about a love that you've lived in before, okay? How did it feel? How did it taste? Where is it still stored in your body? Because, you know, I love the idea, and I kind of incorporate this in some of my artwork sometimes, that energy is neither created nor destroyed, but it's like transformed. So for the good, the bad, and the ugly, those loves that you've experienced before, there are still pockets of energy that still exist in this world. So where is it stored in your body? And what did it teach you, if anything? And I want to give y'all a second just to engage the chat. I want y'all to go ahead and drop it in. I want to see, because y'all know your boy. I'm gonna tell y'all what love feels like to me. But I want to take a second. I want to see how y'all are feeling on it. Ooh, yes, safe feeling in my gut, in my chest. I love that. I love that. That's beautiful. Yes, yes, indeed. All right, thriving. Yes. Ooh, heat. Butterflies. Not y'all got me reminiscing. Freeing. Yes, I love these. I love these. They're such beautiful descriptors, right? Peaceful and grounded. Yes. These are the loves that I want to live in. Yes, loves to me feel safe, supporting, life enhancing, seen, visibility. That's so critically important. And in that one comment alone of love allowing you to feel seen, it kind of underscores, you know, what I want this presentation to really get at, that idea that our ability to love and to be romanced and to engage is so critical in the fullness of our lives. Simple. I love that. I love that, because we know that sometimes I feel like a byproduct of love is complication, but love in and of itself is like the simplest thing in the world, right? It gets complicated because we as human beings have, you know, our own complexities, our own nuances, our own quirks, our own baggage, but love itself is so simple, strong and supported, to be my full self and to learn to be more. A pleasure that pain doesn't negate. Now that is powerful. That is powerful right there, right? Because going back to that point, like love, you know, comes with like these byproduct complexities, but that doesn't mean that those complexities throw away what love is. Thank y'all so much for that engagement. I love what y'all have to say on that. And so now I'm gonna think about what love looks like to me, right? When I think about some of the things that love can do. So for me, love heals, right? And that's why for me, when I think about Black queer folk and our ability to engage love, and not only engage love, but engage it in a proud way, engage it in a way where we can own that love and really say, this is me, this is mine right here, this is what I live in, this is what I love in. It's something that is so critical, but because of the stigma that is attached to our identity, our very right to feel as though we can really express that is hindered. Our right to be able to feel that we can show up and say, you know, as a man, my boyfriend, right? And to be able to come into the room confidently and not think twice about it, right? And so when we're able to live in loves where we can love out loud, where we can be loved out loud, that's healing to me, right? Love humbles. Once again, going back to that part, right, that love is a pleasure that pain doesn't negate. I love that. And what love does oftentimes is it humbles you, right? So I live a life where I did not disclose until I was 22 years old, okay? I didn't have sexual relationships before then. I didn't have romantic relationships. I like to joke that the only thing I had before 22 was unrequited love. And I'm 25 now for context, okay? But at 22, I came out, right? And I had so many ideas of what dating was gonna be like and so many ideas of what love was gonna be like. And this is what I'm not doing and this is what I'm going to do and this is what I expect. And then all of a sudden, when I began to date, when I began to engage love, when I began to engage romance, I started to learn so much about myself and so much about the way that I could stretch, right? And then solidifying some of the things that I just very much was like, these are non-negotiables. This is what I need in my love, right? But before you really are able to engage that love, I think there are so many things in your mind in an ideal world, what you will and what you won't do, right? So love humbles. Love challenges. Once again, love will stretch you in some ways that you never could have imagined being stretched. You will see highs and lows in your romance that really just change your mind, that change your perspective. They open you up to the reality of what life can be. Love reveals. The beautiful thing is love reveals so much about the world, so much about others, but it reveals a hefty deal about yourself as well. Things that, you never would have considered. Love mystifies. That's what I love about romance particularly, right? So these are things that love can do generally, whether it be across romantic loves, platonic loves, but when you look up the definition of romance, it talks about like that feeling of excitement, that feeling of mystery that we attach to love. So love mystifies, right? Love is why am I feeling this way? Like, why am I looking at my phone and I can't stop smiling? Like, why did this person just irritate the hell out of me? But they're the only thing I can think about right now. Right? So love presents all of these dynamic experiences that leave us bewildered sometimes, that leave us questioning, like, how does this work? What is the function of this? And finally, what I really want to focus on for the sake of a lot of the argument of my presentation and some of the research that we'll look at is that love humanizes. Love humanizes. And when you are Black and queer, right, these identities that are separately stigmatized, and then you also acknowledge the compounded stigma of them at their intersection, we think about what it is to exist in our love and to know these loves, but to have people tell you that you are not deserving of that love, or to have people tell you that that love is immoral, that that love is wrong, that it is not something that you should have access to, right? Because what we understand about love is that love humanizes. No matter what your love experience looks like, no matter what your romance looks like, you know that other people around the world are globally connected in this experience. And they are healing from this at the same time that you're healing. They're humbled as you are humbled. They are challenged as you are challenged, having things revealed to them as you're having things revealed to them. And they're mystified by it, just like you're mystified by it. And being able to exist in your love and to be able to describe the fullness of your love, that is something that connects you to the humanity of other people. And so a big part of my argument is that when we as Black queer folk are shunned for our loves, are cast out and ostracized for our loves, what does that do? That begins to dehumanize us. When we have to come into situations where everybody else gets to talk about their love, when everybody else gets to talk about their sexual adventures and curiosity, all of these like really dynamic elements of their lives that matter to their full personhood, and we feel as though we have to shut that. We feel as though we have to keep it secret. We feel as though we have to keep it private. I don't want the backlash of somebody negatively criticizing and saying, oh, we don't want to hear all that, right? And as a result, that dehumanizes me. I am not able to engage in this really phenomenal global and universal experience, right? All right, so some things I want us to think about, right? How do Black queer folk approach, access, and interpret love? And one of the most important things as we ask this question, I want us to think about, what are the narratives that are already available? Okay, because as I sat with this particular question, one thing that I really had to reconcile is the extent to which Black romantic narratives, queer romantic narratives separately, and then of course at their intersection, how they generally center around trauma, around grief, around pain, around this particular type of resilience that overcomes from like a negative overcoming, right? And what do those narratives tell us about our own experiences, right? Because in reality, that do derive from some truth. And, you know, there are so many different angles from which we could address that. You could look at the fact that being a Black American within this context, because so much of our history with respect to this country does derive from a painful place, from slavery, from post-slavery discrimination and prejudice. Like you can understand how a lot of that spills over into our narratives, right? But how does that stay in us? You know, earlier we talked about this idea that energy stays with us, that these experiences stay with us. So when we are dreaming up the bounds of like our queer loves, right? Like what influences that? What images are we seeing? And I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm a big person. I love queer media. Okay, when I tell you, any app I'm going to Hulu. I'm gonna go to Tubi. I'm gonna go to Netflix. I want to go to the LGBTQ plus section because I want to see myself. And the one thing that I can undeniably say is that you really have to brace yourself for a lot of the stories in which we are depicted, because there is some, you know, some element of pain, some element of trauma, right? And that's, if I just say my queer identity, right? I don't even want to get started on the Black side of my identity, right? Where we just think about generally, what is Black representation? And I remember this was a conversation on Twitter some time back, is that, you know, whenever we see Black History Month, whenever we see celebrating Black voices, look at some of what is included, right? So like we think about 12 years a slave, right? I feel like we can remember our history without necessarily using the language celebrate, right? So like celebrating this painful narrative. I wanna remember, right? I want to pay homage, I want to recognize, I wanna hold space for. But if the extent of my celebration is pain, trauma, grief, right? I have to dig deeper, right? Because in the way that I want to build the love, and I can't speak for everybody on the call, but at least for the way that I want to build my Black queer love, I want it to exist in something more than pain. I want it to exist in something more than trauma and something more than grief. And as important as those things are in being honored and being recognized and being remembered, there also has to be a healthy balance for hope, a healthy balance for belief, right? A balance for healthy, growing love, right? So we have to be very critical of the narratives that we have access to and how we are incorporating them in the way that we are building our ideas of love. Next, what is the function of concealing our experiences of romantic and sexual intimacy? So I immediately think of, and maybe this feels too much of a trope, but I think at least the trope is derivative of something. I think about when you are a closeted young man growing up and you are around other young men, and whether it just be a result of patriarchy, heteronormativity, toxic masculinity, whatever term you really want to focus on, a lot of the conversation, especially in that like post-puberty age, is around sex, right? Is around attraction, is around all of these things that as a queer person in disguise, you're not necessarily able to engage, right? Because even when you grow up, depending on your caliber of friend group, you know, the conversation about sex and romance, as long as it's heteronormative, can always kind of flow, Your boys can talk back and forth. But then when you as a queer man might want to enter into conversation about your queer romantic experiences, about your queer sexual experiences, that's really the big flag, right? Whenever you want to talk about sex, things get a little complicated, things get a little sticky, you know, people become uncomfortable, right? And to borrow from a tweet I saw that was so powerful, it kind of talked about various liberation struggles and movements, and how when we think about certain things, we think about them really specific instead of what they are at the core. And so like when you think about gay marriage, you're talking about marriage. When you're thinking about gays having the right to adopt, you're talking about adoption, right? At the core of these things, we are not talking about having access to some special right that is just, you know, being pulled out of the rabbit's hat. We are saying, let's have the rights that everyone else already has, right? This isn't some new exceptional philosophy that has never been done before. This is literally what everyone else under a heteronormative guise is able to do, but me being able to get access to that. So when I'm with my homeboys and I'm talking about queer sexual experiences and queer romantic experiences, I'm talking about romance. I'm talking about sex. I'm talking about the exact same things that you are. But because of the grips of maybe some heteronormative or like white supremacist values that are all working together in terms of what normal and what puritanical and what righteous behavior is, now there's like this imbalance of, you know, we don't want to engage what I'm talking about now. Now there's this discomfort where there was not a discomfort before. And even as I thought about this, what is so interesting, right? So there's this one pole of the extreme that the majority of this presentation talks about, which is the way we de-romanticize, the way we desexualize our lives, right? And how that ultimately dehumanizes us, because essentially we're not able to play the game, right? But then I also think of the other pole of that, right? Which is, if we're not being de-romanticized and desexualized, to some degree, we're being over-sexualized. To some degree, we're being fetishized, right? I remember an experience from some years back. I was dealing with this guy and, you know, I popped up on him and one of his friends was over, you know, nice girl. And we were just having casual conversation. And she proceeds to say, I want to watch. First off, hell no. And I mean that with all of my chest. Secondly, you know, at first I was kind of jarred because I was like, you know, maybe that was a joke. And that's not to kink shame anyone who is into watching, but especially as someone who was newly out, there was a moment of pause where I felt like an experiment, right? And so it is interesting how we really do exist sometimes in these two extremes where either sex and romance are completely off the table. We're not going to talk about that at all. We're not going to engage that at all. Or you're on the other side of the extreme, which is like, you immediately think of me as a sexual creature. And one thing I often talk about in a lot of this discourse is the way that sexuality is immediately sexualized. Sexuality is immediately sexualized. And what do I mean by that? So when I tell you that I am a queer man, you immediately think, or not, maybe not necessarily you, because I know we have some evolved thinkers on the call, but many people will immediately think when I say that I'm a queer man, the first thing you think about is, who does he have sex with, right? You don't ask questions about emotional attraction. You don't ask questions about maybe physical non-sexual intimacy, right? So when we think about sexual identity and gender identity and sexual attraction, we are talking about a lot more than just singularly sexual intercourse, right? But because sometimes there is limited discourse around what sexuality is, we kind of like sift out those other important key elements to it. And as a result, knowing my queerness automatically deems me as a sexual being in your mind, and the associations that you have in proximity to my romance, to my sex life, is purely about sex, right? Sexual intercourse. And that's a portion of it, but that is not the sum of it, right? So sex is a part of the sum. Sex is not the sum, right? But sometimes we are perceived and interpreted in that way. And finally, what is the aftermath? What is the psychological aftermath of seeing everybody else be able to live in these full loves and to engage it, and then to kind of, you know, go home and have to ruminate on who you are and how you want those same things in some capacities, but that if you were to show up as who you fully are, now that is something that will end for you deleteriously, right? Like nobody wants to live in that, right? And as the beautiful panel before said, which I thought was just so brilliant to tie this in, we always have to think about the physiological impact of our trauma that is associated with the psychological impact of our trauma. Because one thing that we know, definitely as mental health professionals, is that oftentimes mental health is not taken as seriously as it needs to be taken. And a lot of times, unfortunately, it isn't until things are put into physical parameters that people see the seriousness, right? You know, to understand that this stress and this trauma and this grief actually can take years off your life. And the craziest part about this is that a lot of it is construct driven. These are man-made limitations and restrictions that can very materially lend to my shortened life or to my decreased quality of life. So what we will do in just a little bit is look at some of the excerpts from the research that I am doing now that centers around a broader question, and I'll speak to that as well. But yeah, we're gonna look at some first cycle coding, and we're gonna look at some preliminary themes that are kind of emerging. And like I said, if you see something and it makes you want to holler, drop it in the chat, because I love for us to engage, and I'm gonna try to make sure I leave some time toward the end so that we can actually have some Q&A. All right, so the origin of the question, where did this even come from? So the broader study that I was telling you about that I'm conducting right now looks at how external constructs, such as heteronormativity, white supremacy, how they work individually and how they work together in influencing intracommunal dynamics in Black queer communities. So translation for all that to say, how do these outside philosophies impact how we as Black queer people deal with each other, right? And so I'm in interview with one of my participants, and we're talking about in psychology what we call concealable stigma. This idea that for some of us, our stigma isn't immediately visible, right? You wouldn't know that we are perhaps of a sexual minority, or that we are a religious minority, or that we're an individual with a disability. You might not know about any of these identifiers just by looking at us, right? And she says, I like to use myself as an example. My coworkers back home, some of them think I'm gay, some of them don't know. I guess it's because I don't talk about my love life with anybody. That's nobody's business but my own. And that is not to knock that there are people out there who are private, that there are people out there that are secretive and who believe that, just romance, love, that's not something I want to discuss with anybody. But something that sat with me after that interview, I just sat and thought to myself, I know what love is to me, right? And I know what the height of that experience can be. And I think about love, and I think about how love is something that I want to yell at the top of the mountain, right? I want everybody to know about, I want everybody to engage. And what I said and thought was, now it's very true that this participant really might think that it's nobody's business but her own. But I had to really sit and reconcile this idea that part of that could be that the world that she lives in has made her believe that in order to get ahead, that in order to survive, she has to de-romanticize the life she lives. She has to desexualize the life she leads. She has to be careful about the pronouns that she uses in the way that she narrates her own life, right? And I started to think about these restrictions. And so mind you, this research has a completely different question, but that's what I love about semi-structured interview, is you come in with a list of questions, but as you see certain themes emerging, you can add questions, you can take questions away, right? So I added a question that was pointed toward our experiences of love, and that's what some of these narratives will speak to in just a second. So one thing I want to bring up is that Black queer romance needs Black queer imagination, and I love divine affirmation. So anybody who is in attendance for the previous session, we talked a little bit about Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, right? And what I love that van der Kolk talks about within The Body Keeps the Score is this idea that trauma impacts our imagination and how critical imagination is in our ability to hope, to believe, to dream, to desire things. And so what I want us to really interrogate is the extent to which these man-made trauma and grief-inducing situations of the constructs that we have of heteronormativity and white supremacy, how they influence how we as Black queer folk are able to imagine our lives. And this can be in many domains. It doesn't just have to be limited to romance. It could be who you believe you can be as an academician, who you believe you can be as a professional, as an entrepreneur, but specifically with context to this conversation, how does our trauma around our sexual identity, around our racial identity, around the intersection of racial and sexual identity, how does that limit our imagination, and how does that affect our approaches to romance? Something that was so sobering. In one of the interviews that I was conducting, I asked what social workers, who engage in solutions-based therapy, what we call the miracle question. If you ask your client, if you woke up tomorrow, All your problems were gone away. Everything was perfect. What would that world look like? And so I asked one of my participants, I said, you know, with respect to some of the stigma attached to your identity, the stigma attached to your love, what would it look like if tomorrow you woke up and everything was copacetic, everything was as it needs to be? And before she could give me that answer, she said, you know what? I actually shut down when you asked me that question, because I thought to myself, oh, that's not gonna happen. That's not gonna happen. And if you remember nothing else from this presentation, I want you to remember how the way that we move in the world and the way that these systems work against marginalized people, and for the specific context of this presentation, the way that systems work against Black queer folk, it kills our imagination of what can be, right? And even in a hypothetical situation where we are asked to dream a better world, to dream a more equitable world, our imagination has been wounded to a degree sometimes that we can't even fathom what that would look like. So I've heard a little bit about what y'all have to say about love. I've heard a little bit about what I have to say about love. What do the ancestors say about love? You know, I would be remiss if I didn't bring in my trifecta to do some consultation on the beauty of love, right? So we have Mother Hooks, Father Baldwin, and Mother Morrison. I think no other scholar is more attached to love than our beloved Bell Hooks, who here says, to truly love, we must learn to mix various ingredients: care, affection, recognition, respect, commitment, and trust, as well as honest and open communication. And what I love about Bell Hooks' approach to love is that she has always called us higher. She has called us to interrogate what we really believe love is, and the instances in which we have really been loving, and the instances in which we haven't been loving, right? I think when it comes to love, sometimes we have a very moralized perspective where we feel as though I'm loving all the time, I'm perfect all the time. You know, there has never been a second I haven't loved you. And what I love is that Bell Hooks talks about certain things that negate love, right? Or that even, as she is saying here, that there are certain things that are elements of love, but you need a little bit more than just one of them, right? She even talks about this concept of cathexis, this idea that you can have this attachment, this strong bond and attachment to something while not actually loving it, right? So there are plenty of people in your life that you care for, or that you have affection for, or that you have recognition for, that you have respect for, that you have commitment for. But it takes more than just having one or two of them, right? Love is full in scale, right? And we have to engage very critically, as the text often says in regard to love, how are we extending ourselves to the spiritual growth of other people, right? Love him and let him love you. Do you think anything else under heaven really matters? And this is pulled from Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. And it was very controversial, but very illuminating because it speaks to a same-sex relationship. And what I love, going back to how we described love earlier as something that's simple, I love the simplicity of love, this idea that at the core of it, what else outside of love could matter, right? We have these constructs, we have these violences against us, we have these discriminations, but when it comes to the core simplicity of love, loving someone and allowing them to love you back, what else under heaven really matters? And then one of my favorite quotes of all times that speak to love, love is or it ain't, then love ain't love at all. And this is from Toni Morrison's Beloved. And what I just love about that is, once again, the simplicity and the truth that lies in that statement. And once again, when it comes to my mission of, you know, a world that Black queer youth don't have to heal from, and a world where Black queer folk of all ages are getting what they need in terms of restoration, in terms of peace, in terms of love and love abundantly, of life and life abundantly, I think about this idea that we as Black queer folks should be able to access a thick love, a full love, not a love that has to be secret if we don't want it to be. Mind you, if you are a naturally private person, you just prefer to keep, you know, things under hush, that is totally fine. But what I want us to interrogate is, you know, the people like me, right, growing up, who said, oh no, I would love to be in a relationship. Oh, my best friend got a boyfriend. Oh, I want a boyfriend. I wanna have somebody to go cuddle with, you know. I wanna have somebody that can hold your hand in the daylight. I remember the first time, you know, I was seeing a guy and he held my hand in public. The way I froze, but the way that like opened up something in me and let me know, once again, going back to that imagination, I began to imagine all of the possibilities of my queer love, right? And now, as I envision my own version of queer love, it is something that is full. It is something that doesn't have to hide. It is something that grows, and it is something that can grow others just by its visibility. All right, so now we're gonna look at a few excerpts from my interviews that I've been conducting, like I said, for the broader research question I have with respect to heteronormativity and white supremacy and intracommunal dynamics. Now that I entered into the chat, this question of like romance, right? So one of the interviewees said, we didn't know how to exist happily outside of four walls. So it was all fun and games when we were in the dorm room or when we were in the apartment or when we were in good company. But once we stepped outside, we didn't know what the boundaries were. And I can say, as someone who has dealt with this from personal experience, but also as someone who has seen other Black queer folk deal with that, it is such a complex experience to engage in this romantic code switching. This idea where we can delve so deeply into connection, into intimacy behind closed doors. But then when we go out, and you know, as the Black community knows all too well, that's your special friend, you know, that you brought to Thanksgiving, you know, for like 10 Thanksgivings in a row. You know, y'all living life together. That's your special friend, right? So being able to know, who am I when we go into a different space? Like, I'm baby behind closed doors, but when we're in an academic space or when we're in a professional space, and you feel like people don't need to know who you are, I'm somebody different, right? And how does that wear me down internally? How does that wear us down internally as a unit? And then, you know, and this kind of speaks to it as well, intra-relationship conflict, right? So we're talking about conflict that exists within the relationship now as a result of an external force. And so the interviewee says, and so it caused anxiety within the both of us when we would go out to the point we would always engage in disagreements, not because we were actually disagreeing with each other. Listen to that. Not because we were actually disagreeing with each other, but because we were both shaking and unsure and anxious about how to exist in the world as a proud. She begins to say proud and she rescinds it and she says out couple. Now I feel like we have a whole presentation on the delineation between proud and out, the subjectivity and objectivity of one. But something that is so interesting here is the way that conflict starts to exist in our relationship based on external forces, right? Because and I think we've all been in a situation where we can take it even outside of the context of sexuality and who we present ourselves as in the world. How many of y'all been with Bae and y'all are trying to figure something out and you getting anxious and Bae is anxious and you like, I'm really irritable right now because we both trying to figure this out and I'm getting frustrated and you getting frustrated and it's compounding frustration, right? And now there's this internal conflict that has been created in this relationship right now, even if momentarily with lasting, you know, consequences though, because of external expectations and because of external judgments. Then we talk about intersectional capacity limitations. I think it was Dr. Files who spoke brilliantly to that language of capacity earlier. So the interviewee says, I'm already on the edge right now, just being a Black person, being a Black presenting femme, but me holding your hand is the edge for me. Like, I don't have more. Like, I can't kiss you right now. Like, that would already be pushing it too far. Like, I already feel like I'm in danger, right? And this goes back to the overarching theme, once again, of the intersectional experience of Black queer folk. When people say, you know, why do you have to be so specific, right? Why isn't it just Black issues? Or why isn't it just queer issues? Because the intersection matters. The intersection matters when we're talking about capacity limitations and where if I am, as the interview was speaking to, if I'm already in a predominantly white space where I already feel a nerve attached to my racial identity, and then you want to take it further, me also knowing that to exist in a white space is also to by default exist in a heteronormative space, right? And now I have to also try to conquer my fear of not only being a racial minority, but also being a sexual minority and not knowing what happens next. And then this is something that, you know, is really chilling when you think about, but this idea that actual and implied realities carry similar consequences. So the interviewee says, you know, no one is staring or holding pitchforks, but that is the feeling that is created. And when we talk about mental health equity, when we talk about sexual and romantic equity and the narratives that we can share and the narratives that we can approach and the narratives that we can access, we must understand that just because the day didn't end in the pitchforks, just because the day didn't end in the slur, doesn't mean that your body didn't psychologically and or physiologically respond the same way, okay? Because whether that slur came out and was actualized, whether the pitchforks came, your heart was still racing, right? Your blood pressure still rose, right? You were still sweating. You were still shaky. There are still physiological and psychological complications and consequence, whether the discrimination that you fear is actual or implied. Then there's heteronormative constraints on romantic and sexual imagination. And I love, the interviewee, when he spoke to this, he kind of talked about this like one of the messy Twitter topics, and he was absolutely right, where we dive into this conversation around preferences, right? And what he says is, I've also had to interrogate, why do I see masculinity as something I want to obtain? Why do I want to be proximal to that, to be attached to that? It's being with someone who is your stereotypical jock type or whatever, very masculine, but he just likes boys too. Like, is that more important to you than being with someone who actually cares for you, shows you love, appreciation, compassion, all those things but might present differently, but they might make you happy? And what I love about this is, in a way, that this also speaks to the idea of limitations on our imagination, right? And that proximity to power that we have discussed a little earlier, where it's, I might not be the most masculine man, but I know there's power attached to masculinity. And because of that, I find you attractive. Because of that, even if I could recognize and reconcile that femininity is beautiful as well, I understand that there's a different type of power that emanates from that masculinity of someone who is masculine in presentation than someone who is femme in presentation, right? And so the way that our preferences even develop, right? That's your preference. However, look at the constructs outside that have actually guided, right? What are the implications of femininity that are subconsciously running through our head when we are deeming who is attractive, when we are deeming what romance is, and even sexual relationships we want to pursue? Selective imitation. Now, this next interviewee was speaking to the idea of how romance, how love, and how identity can exist in their undergrad setting, right? So they attended an HBCU, and what they noted was, the HBCU, you want to be like these PWIs, but if you think about it, some of these PWIs have whole centers for LGBTQ plus community people. And now comes this really interesting phenomenon of like selective imitation, is what I've kind of coded this as, right? Which is this idea that we want to borrow from what has been given to us in terms of heteronormative ideals, right? Patriarchal ideals, white supremacist values of traditional marriage and traditional heterosexual relationships, right? We want to borrow from that. But then when PWIs, even if they are performative, because I'm not even gonna try to pretend like I believe that there is a full, sincere investment in diversity and inclusion methods all the time. But you'll notice that the PWIs are going to have some form of diversity and inclusion, even if it is performative. And now for you as a Black queer person, you're kind of put in the crux, and you're stuck in between, am I going to be at a place that should be a safe space? And this doesn't just have to be limited to an HBCU. It can be any type of institution that should be a safe space for you. Am I going to go here where there is clearly no space for me? Or am I going to go to this other system, this other institution that might have performative resources, but the resources are at least there? And this is something else that the interviewee goes on to say. Now, I've spent 4 years at this school, and I've only seen one person with something, and this interviewee is referencing a safe zone marker like that. He couldn't even have it on his door. He had to tell you through an email or face-to-face. You start to think, am I crazy? And what I love about that is that highlights this idea that, once again, our safe spaces start to wear the costume and decor of our oppressor, right? These are values that we did not think up in and of ourselves, right? These homophobic and transphobic and queerphobic values, these white supremacist and heteronormative values, these patriarchal values, these are not values that we as Black folk just gave to ourselves, right? But the consequence is still damning, and the consequence is lasting, right? Where there have to be people like professionals in academic spaces that have to let you know they're there, but that have to be very careful, understanding the blowback that comes when they are very articulate and outspoken about the reality that LGBTQ plus people face. And to go back to the literature, I always thought this was fascinating, and this goes back to my overarching research. And what even wants, to make me look at like power constructs is this idea that all Black folks, we're obviously different, right? But there are three things that kind of bind all of us, right? There's African heritage, there's the impact of slavery, and there's the continuity of racism and prejudice. And why that is so fascinating to me as we think about some of the divides intracommunally as like Black cis het folks and then Black queer folks, and how it's so easy for some Black cis het folk to arm up against us, right? And to kind of now we can divide, right? Because there's this power differential. Like, I don't have whiteness, but I have, I lean into heteronormativity. I have access to straightness, which at least gets me closer to you to whiteness than you are, right? And so that's always been fascinating to me, to think that we are bound by these things that are so strong, and yet, what some of the literature speaks to and what some of the questions that my research seeks to answer is how access to this power is so driving, it's so enamoring, it's so attractive, that sometimes we as marginalized folk will sell out other marginalized folks if we feel we can get closer in proximity to these certain elements of power. So finally, before we have a few minutes for just some open dialogue, some questions, how are we creating spaces for Black queer romance to thrive? So number one, we need to implement affirmative-based practices. And this is beautiful for two reasons. Number one, it reinforces self-identity, right? It allows a person to know, as a Black queer person, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with the way you love. There's nothing wrong with this joy and with this life you wish to lead. And in addition to that, it validates the weight of their grief. It validates the weight of their experience. By show of hands, all the Black folks on the call, I almost know, and honestly, probably in a lot of minority spaces, you know what it is to be told, this is my house. You're gonna do what I tell you to do as long as you're in my house. If you wanna do what you wanna do, you're gonna have to get up out of my house, right? What does that do growing up to you as you are going through your own traumatic experiences? Number one, that is a traumatic experience in and of itself, to feel like your attachment to worth and your attachment to safety and security is bound to this personality that you can perform, right? You're not trying to live a life, you're trying to perform the life. And so a lot of us are exposed to that rhetoric, even as Black folk in America, right? When we have racial justice issues, and you have sanctimonious white people who will say, well, if you don't like it, go back to Africa, right? There are so many opportunities where marginalized folks have their experiences invalidated. And when you have affirmative-based practices, that is a beautiful opportunity to say, I see you, I see the fullness and validity of who you are. And I also understand how there should have been someone along the way who checked in and said, you know what? I understand why you feel this way. You have the right to feel this way, right? So we have to affirm the validity of the people we work with, of our friends, of our family, of queer folk everywhere, that experiences are valid and how they have shaped us. Also, let's be sure that we're celebrating diverse identities and experiences and narratives, right? And the reason I bold and italicize celebrate is because celebrating is different from acceptance, y'all. Y'all know that, right? Just as acceptance is different from tolerating, just like tolerating is different from rejection. And I don't want us to get too comfortable because acceptance feels far away from rejection, that we feel like that is the best we can do, when instead of saying like, I don't really understand it or whatever, but I guess you okay, right? Like, we have this deeming power to give and to say if someone is acceptable or is not acceptable, right? So instead of just saying I accept it, take it a step further. Say I celebrate diverse identity. Say we need to see more stories like you. We need to hear more about your romantic experiences and about what it was for you to grow up as a youth, so that we can be better for the youth that are coming behind you. Like, we need access to this diversity. We love this diversity. It makes us better. It doesn't take away. It doesn't, put my rights in jeopardy. It doesn't put my narratives into jeopardy. It does the opposite. It expands room for more rights and for more of our beautiful narratives. Also, interrogate your attitudes and responses toward diverse representations of Black queer romance. I know I got some P Valley girls on the call. I just know I have to. That show is too much of, phenomenon to like not have some of y'all on here. But I think about when we see the evolution of Big Teak and Lil Murda's relationship. I want you to take a second and I want you to think about the way that Twitter reacted to seeing mask on mask romance, sexuality, intimacy, right? I want you to think about how your inner circles might have talked about it. I want you to think about how people around the world were kind of navigating this conversation about a narrative that they don't see a lot of. And I want you to think about what must it have been like to be maybe a disclosed, mask-presenting queer person who might not, be disclosed, who finally sees an image that looks like you, but now you have some hesitance. Because you hear what people say. You hear about how they criminalize and how they kind of like weaponize sexuality against you now. And now you're not gonna wanna disclose. You're not going to wanna engage in a romance or a sexuality that is lived out loud because you see the harm that happens in relation to that, in relation to people just being who they are and living the lives that they lead. And finally, I want you to ask, what does your activism look like, right? So as non-Black folk, as non-queer folk, where does your privilege lie? Where can you open space for more narratives around Black queer folk? Where can you be assisting in this liberation struggle, right? And for Black queer folk, what does your activism look like? And as you kind of reflect on that, the one piece of activism I want you to know that you have full access to is rest. Rest is a part of the activism. Rest is not tangential. Rest does not come after the activism. Rest is a part. Rest needs to be intermittent in what you're doing, right? Because we're getting up here, we're telling our narratives, we're doing the research, but we also want to make sure there is room for us to refuel, to get what we need, to not constantly feel like we have to be the teacher, to know that sometimes activism very much simply is taking a day off. Is unplugging, is letting someone know, I can't walk you through this element of Black queerness today, but I'll refer you out or call me back later. We can do this, but we can't do this right now. So yes, as time was ticking, I definitely was speeding toward the race line so that we could have some Q&A. Thank you so much, Nadia, No More Martyrs, for having me. I absolutely love y'all and love this space, and I'm very thankful to have been able to share.